Chapter 1, The House Everyone Laughed At. At the far end of Maplewood Lane stood a small, aging house that looked like it had quietly slipped out of time. The paint had long faded from its wooden walls, leaving behind uneven shades of pale gray and chipped blue. The front porch leaned slightly to one side, and the garden was nothing more than a patch of stubborn soil where wild grass fought against the dry ground. Compared to the polished homes that lined the rest of the street, the house looked like an unwanted memory. Maplewood Lane was known as one of the proudest neighborhoods in the city. Every house stood tall with freshly painted fences, trimmed lawns, and shiny cars resting comfortably in wide driveways. The residents believed their street represented success, stability, and status. People waved politely during morning walks, but beneath those smiles lived quiet comparisons and silent judgments. And nothing on Maplewood Lane invited more judgment than the little house at the end. That house belonged to the Rivera family. The family had arrived one quiet afternoon at the beginning of spring, bringing with them a moving truck that looked almost as old as the house they were about to occupy. Their furniture was modest, their belongings few, and their arrival barely caused a ripple in the neighborhood's carefully arranged routine. But it didn't take long for the whispers to begin. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the family carried in second-hand furniture and worn boxes. Some noticed the mismatched chairs, others noticed the patched clothing the family wore while unloading their things. Maplewood Lane was not used to that kind of arrival. Most families there moved in with interior designers, contractors, and expensive landscaping teams. The Rivera family arrived with determination, quiet smiles, and a willingness to work with whatever they had. The father, Daniel Rivera, was the first person neighbors noticed clearly. He was a tall man with tired eyes and strong hands that spoke of years of labor. Every morning before the sun rose, he would step out of the house wearing simple work clothes and worn boots, leaving in an old pickup truck that rattled slightly when it started. The truck had clearly seen better days. Neighbors often paused during their morning coffee when they heard the truck's engine echo down the street. Some of them laughed. Others shook their heads. The street had grown used to the quiet hum of luxury vehicles. The sound of Daniel's truck felt like an interruption. His wife, Maria Rivera, brought a different energy to the neighborhood. While Daniel left early each morning, Maria stayed behind, slowly working to repair the small house with her own hands. She painted sections of the fence when she could afford supplies, planted vegetables in the stubborn garden soil, and hung small flower pots along the porch. The changes were small, but they were steady. Yet the neighborhood didn't see determination. They saw struggle, and struggle made people uncomfortable. Children in the neighborhood noticed the Rivera family's son, Lucas, almost immediately. He was about 13 years old, quiet and observant, often seen helping his mother in the garden or carrying tools for his father when Daniel returned home late in the evening. Lucas walked to school every morning with a worn backpack that had been repaired more than once. The other children noticed. Children often reflect the attitudes they hear at home. Some laughed at the patch bag. Others whispered about the small house at the end of the street. None of them noticed the quiet focus in Lucas's eyes. Meanwhile, the adults on Maplewood Lane had formed their own silent opinions. The Rivera family didn't fit the image of the neighborhood. Their house needed repairs. Their yard wasn't perfect. Their truck was loud. Their clothes were simple. And in a place where appearance meant everything, that was enough to make them outsiders. At neighborhood gatherings, the Rivera family's name occasionally surfaced in conversations. People wondered how they had managed to buy property there. Some speculated about financial mistakes. Others simply laughed about the old house at the end. The laughter was never loud enough for the Riveras to hear. But it was loud enough to travel. One afternoon during early summer, a group of neighbors stood chatting near the sidewalk while watching Daniel attempt to repair part of his leaning porch. Sweat covered his face as he carefully replaced a broken board, measuring twice before hammering the nail. The work was slow, but it was precise. From across the street, a few neighbors exchanged amused looks. The house in their eyes looked like a project that would never be finished. But Daniel wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was building something more important than appearances. Inside that house lived patience, discipline, and quiet resilience. Every night after work, Daniel spent hours fixing small parts of the home. Maria worked beside him whenever she could, holding boards, organizing tools, or painting small sections. Lucas helped whenever schoolwork allowed. The three of them worked together with a rhythm that didn't require many words. Their home was slowly changing. Not in dramatic ways, but in honest ones. The fence stood a little straighter. The porch felt stronger. Flowers began to bloom where weeds once dominated. Still, the neighborhood continued to see only what they expected to see. A poor family trying to survive in a place they didn't belong. What Maplewood Lane failed to notice was the quiet strength growing inside that small house. The Rivera family wasn't just repairing walls. They were building stability. Daniel's long hours at work were slowly changing their future. Maria's careful gardening was more than decoration, it was preparation. Lucas's quiet determination at school was shaping something far greater than anyone around him understood. But none of that was visible from the outside. To the neighbors, the Rivera house remained a small, awkward presence at the end of their perfect street. A reminder of something they preferred not to see. So the laughter continued. The whispers continued. And Maplewood Lane remained certain of one thing. The Rivera family would always be the poorest people on the street. What no one realized was that time has a strange way of revealing truths. And the quiet family everyone laughed at was slowly becoming the one family the entire neighborhood would one day depend on. But that realization was still months away. For now, Maplewood Lane continued to watch the little house at the end of the street with quiet amusement, completely unaware that the future was quietly preparing a lesson none of them would ever forget. And as summer slowly turned toward autumn, the Rivera family continued their quiet work, unnoticed, underestimated, and unknowingly preparing for the moment when everything on Maplewood Lane would change. The moment when the neighborhood that laughed would suddenly find itself in desperate need of the very family they once dismissed. That moment was closer than anyone realized. And it would begin with a problem no one on Maplewood Lane knew how to solve. The beginning of a problem that would soon test the entire neighborhood. Summer slowly faded into autumn, and Maplewood Lane continued its quiet routine of comfort and pride. The trees that lined the street turned golden and red, their leaves falling gently onto the perfectly maintained lawns. Homeowners spent their weekends raking leaves and decorating their porches with pumpkins and seasonal wreaths. Everything looked peaceful, orderly, and well-managed. On the surface, Maplewood Lane appeared flawless. But beneath that polished appearance, something had quietly begun to change. It started with small signs that most residents ignored. After heavy rain one evening, a large puddle formed near the center of the street. At first, it seemed like nothing unusual. Rainwater occasionally collected there before eventually draining away. But this time, the puddle didn't disappear. Instead, it lingered. Day after day, the water remained in the same spot, spreading slightly wider each time it rained. At first, the neighbors assumed the city would handle it. Maplewood Lane had always relied on the city for maintenance and repairs. When a streetlight failed, the city replaced it. When a sidewalk cracked, a repair crew arrived within weeks. But this time nothing happened. The puddle slowly turned into a shallow pool that reflected the quiet houses surrounding it. Some residents complained to the city office, expecting a quick solution. But weeks passed without any response. Then another problem appeared. Several houses on the lower end of the street began experiencing strange plumbing issues. Water pressure dropped suddenly in the mornings. Some faucets sputtered before producing a steady stream. Toilets began to flush slower than usual. At first, people blamed old pipes. Then they blamed the weather. But the problems continued. Soon, residents began to worry. Maplewood Lane had always been a neighborhood where problems were quickly solved with phone calls and professional services. Contractors, plumbers, and repair teams were always just a phone call away. But something about this situation was different. Plumbers came and inspected individual houses but couldn't find the cause. Some suggested the issue might come from the main water line beneath the street. That possibility made homeowners uneasy. The main water line was not something easily fixed. Repairing it would require digging through the road, shutting off water for days, and potentially costing a fortune if the city refused to take responsibility. Still, most residents assumed the city would eventually step in. They were wrong. A notice eventually arrived from the municipal office explaining that Maplewood Lane's water line had been installed decades ago by a private contractor hired by the neighborhood's original developer, which meant the city wasn't responsible for repairs. The responsibility now belonged to the homeowners themselves. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents gathered in small groups along sidewalks discussing the situation with growing concern. For the first time in years, Maplewood Lane felt uncertain. The street had always prided itself on independence and success, but now the residents faced a problem that couldn't simply be solved with a quick payment. The repairs required coordination and knowledge. A neighborhood meeting was soon organized in the driveway of one of the larger homes. Dozens of residents gathered to discuss the situation. Some brought printed documents, others brought estimates from plumbing companies. The numbers shocked everyone. Repairing the main line beneath the street would require heavy equipment, excavation permits, and specialized contractors. The estimated cost was enormous. Many homeowners believed the project would take weeks. Some worried about damage to their carefully maintained lawns and driveways. Others worried about the financial burden. For the first time, Maplewood Lane felt vulnerable. As the discussion continued, frustration began replacing confidence. Everyone had opinions, but no one had solutions. While the neighbors debated and worried, the Rivera family continued their quiet routine at the far end of the street. Daniel returned home from work each evening, parking his old truck beside the small house. Maria continued tending to her garden and Lucas focused on school. The problem affecting the street had not yet reached their home. But Daniel noticed something others had not. Every evening, as he walked down the street after work, he observed the puddle that had grown into a larger patch of standing water. He noticed the way the pavement around it had slightly shifted. He noticed the pattern of water flowing toward the storm drain but never fully reaching it. And most importantly, he noticed the faint sound beneath the street when cars drove over the wet section. Years of experience had trained Daniel to recognize subtle signs others missed. Daniel Rivera was not just a construction worker. For nearly 2 decades, he had worked in underground infrastructure, repairing pipelines, reinforcing drainage systems, and stabilizing foundations beneath roads and buildings. He had seen problems like this before, and he knew they rarely solved themselves. Still, Daniel kept his observations to himself. Maplewood Lane had never shown interest in the Rivera family's thoughts or experiences. The neighbors had already decided who belonged and who didn't. Daniel had long ago learned that some people only listened when they were ready. So he continued his quiet routine. But the problem beneath Maplewood Lane was growing worse. Heavy rain one night caused the standing water to expand dramatically. By morning, several sections of the street were partially flooded. Cars drove carefully through the water. Residents stepped outside with worried expressions. Something was clearly wrong beneath the pavement. More calls were made to plumbing companies. More inspections were scheduled. But each day the problem seemed to grow. And the cost of fixing it continued to climb. Then something happened that truly alarmed the neighborhood. One morning, a large crack appeared in the road directly beside the standing water. The asphalt had begun to sink slightly. The ground beneath the street was weakening. Suddenly, the situation was no longer just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Emergency warnings were issued to residents advising them to avoid parking near the damaged section. The neighborhood meeting was called again, this time with greater urgency. Homeowners arrived with tense expressions. Fear had replaced frustration. They realized the road could collapse if the problem continued. Still, the central question remained the same. Who could fix it? Contractors demanded extremely high fees. City officials refused responsibility. And none of the homeowners understood the underground system well enough to take control of the situation. The proud residents of Maplewood Lane found themselves facing a problem they couldn't solve with money alone. They needed expertise, but they didn't know where to find it. At the far end of the street, Daniel Rivera stood quietly beside the puddle, studying the damaged pavement. His eyes traced the direction of the water beneath the surface. His mind calculated the pressure building inside the underground pipes. And he slowly realized something the entire neighborhood had overlooked. If the damage wasn't addressed soon, the entire street could collapse. The situation was more serious than anyone on Maplewood Lane understood. And soon, the people who once laughed at the Rivera family would find themselves facing a difficult truth. The only person who truly understood the problem was the man they had spent months ignoring. But Maplewood Lane had not yet realized that. And the moment when they would need Daniel Rivera was coming faster than they expected. The crack in the pavement grew wider with each passing day. What had once been a simple puddle now looked like a warning sign spreading across Maplewood Lane. The asphalt near the center of the street had begun to dip slightly, creating a shallow slope where water collected more aggressively after every rain. Residents could no longer ignore it. Cars slowed down when driving over the damaged area. Some families began parking their vehicles farther away from the affected section. Children were warned not to ride their bicycles near the sinking pavement. The once perfect street had developed a flaw that everyone could see. And it made the neighborhood uneasy. Maplewood Lane had always been a place where problems were handled quietly and quickly. But this situation refused to disappear. Instead, it grew more threatening each day. Another neighborhood meeting was called, this time with even more urgency. Residents gathered again in the same driveway where they had discussed the issue weeks earlier, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The confident tone of the first meeting had vanished. Now the voices were tense, uncertain, and worried. Several homeowners had contacted major construction companies in the city. The companies had sent inspectors to examine the damaged road and underground system. The reports were troubling. According to the professionals, the underground water line had likely developed a serious leak beneath the street. Over time, the escaping water had slowly washed away soil beneath the pavement, weakening the ground that supported the road. If left unrepaired, the entire section of the street could collapse. Repairing it would require digging deep into the road, replacing part of the main pipeline, stabilizing the soil, and rebuilding the pavement. The cost was staggering. Some estimates reached numbers that made the residents fall silent. Many homeowners on Maplewood Lane were wealthy, but even wealth has limits when responsibility is shared among dozens of families. And beyond the financial cost, there was another problem. Time. Every expert warned that the damage was progressing faster than expected. Waiting too long could turn the repair into a far larger disaster. But no one could agree on a plan. Some residents wanted to hire the most expensive construction firm available, hoping that money would guarantee a quick solution. Others argued that the companies were exaggerating the danger to demand higher fees. Meetings stretched longer. Arguments grew louder. Frustration spread across the once peaceful neighborhood. Meanwhile, the Rivera family continued their quiet life at the end of the street. Daniel had been carefully observing the situation for weeks. Every evening after work, he walked past the damaged section of road and studied it closely. His experience with underground infrastructure had taught him how to read the signs beneath the surface. He could see how the water flowed beneath the pavement. He could see where the ground had weakened. And he could see something that most of the contractors had missed. The leak was not located where the road had cracked. It was deeper beneath the street, several meters away from the visible damage. Water was slowly traveling through the soil before emerging at the surface. The contractors had focused on the visible crack. But Daniel understood that repairing the wrong section could make the problem worse. Still, he remained silent. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood something about people. Advice is rarely accepted from those who are underestimated. For months, the residents of Maplewood Lane had quietly dismissed the Rivera family as outsiders who did not belong in their perfect neighborhood. Daniel had seen the laughter. He had heard the whispers. He had noticed the way conversations stopped when he walked nearby. So he kept his knowledge to himself. Until the day everything changed. One morning after a heavy storm, the ground beneath the damaged section of road suddenly shifted. The asphalt sank noticeably, creating a deep depression filled with muddy water. Several parked cars had to be quickly moved away as the ground continued to soften. Residents rushed outside their homes, gathering along the sidewalk with alarmed expressions. The situation had escalated overnight. The road now looked unstable. Large cracks spread across the pavement like spiderwebs. No one felt comfortable driving across it anymore. Emergency barriers were placed around the damaged area to prevent accidents. For the first time, Maplewood Lane truly looked like a street in trouble. More contractors were called. But the new inspections brought even worse news. The soil beneath the street had already been severely eroded. Heavy machinery could cause additional collapses if repairs were not carefully planned. The project had become complicated, dangerous, and extremely expensive. That afternoon, the residents gathered again, this time standing along the edge of the damaged road. Many of them looked helpless. Some stared at the cracked pavement as if hoping it would somehow repair itself. Others quietly calculated the financial burden they might soon face. And then something unexpected happened. Daniel Rivera slowly walked toward the group. He had finished work early that day and had come to inspect the road again. The residents noticed him approaching. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. For months, Daniel had remained a quiet figure at the edge of their neighborhood life. Now he was standing among them, studying the damage with calm concentration. He crouched down near the edge of the cracked pavement, observing the direction of the water flow and the pattern of the soil collapse. Years of experience moved quietly behind his focused expression. He understood exactly what had happened beneath the street. The leak had likely started as a small crack in the main pipe weeks earlier. Gradually, water pressure had pushed soil away from the pipe, creating underground pockets where the ground slowly weakened. The road had eventually begun collapsing into those empty spaces. Daniel knew this kind of damage could be repaired. But it required careful planning and the right approach. For a moment, the group of neighbors watched him in silence. They had spent months overlooking the Rivera family. Now they were watching the quiet man from the small house at the end of the street examine the problem that had defeated multiple contractors. Daniel stood up slowly. He looked at the damaged road one more time. Then he quietly explained what he believed had happened beneath the pavement. The explanation was calm, clear, and surprisingly detailed. He described the direction of the underground leak. He explained how the soil had been eroded. He pointed out the section of the road where excavation should begin. The residents listened carefully. Some of them exchanged uncertain glances. Because for the first time since the problem had started, someone was speaking with certainty. Daniel's understanding of the situation was deeper than anything the contractors had offered. And suddenly, the neighbors began realizing something they had never considered before. The quiet man they had ignored for months might be the only person who truly understood how to save their street. The realization made several residents uncomfortable. Because accepting Daniel's help meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. The family they had laughed at might be the very family capable of solving their biggest problem. But the situation on Maplewood Lane was becoming too serious for pride. The street needed help. And now everyone was beginning to look toward the small house at the end of the road. For the first time since the Rivera family had arrived, the neighborhood was ready to listen. But the real test had not yet begun. Because understanding the problem was only the first step. Fixing it would require something much harder. Trust. And Maplewood Lane still had a lot to learn about that. The damaged road on Maplewood Lane had become impossible to ignore. Yellow safety barriers now surrounded the sinking section of pavement, and warning signs stood along the sidewalk like quiet reminders of the neighborhood's growing problem. What had once been a proud, flawless street now looked uncertain and fragile. Residents who had once taken their peaceful surroundings for granted now stepped outside their homes with worried expressions. The problem beneath the road had exposed something deeper beneath the neighborhood itself. Pride. And pride had suddenly become expensive. After Daniel Rivera explained his understanding of the underground damage, the neighbors spent the evening discussing his observations. Some residents were hesitant at first. After all, they had spent months viewing the Rivera family as outsiders. Trust did not come easily, but the situation left them with few alternatives. The contractors who had inspected the road had offered complicated plans and overwhelming price estimates. None of them had spoken with the clarity that Daniel had shown in just a few minutes. Slowly, the residents began to realize something important. Daniel Rivera knew what he was talking about. Word spread quickly across Maplewood Lane. By the following afternoon, several homeowners approached Daniel while he worked in his garden beside the small house at the end of the street. For the first time since moving in, the Rivera family saw neighbors approaching their home not with curiosity or quiet judgment, but with genuine concern. Daniel listened patiently as the residents explained their worries about the collapsing road and the rising repair costs. He didn't appear surprised. He had been expecting this moment. For weeks he had watched the damage grow, knowing that eventually the neighborhood would need help. And now they were asking. Daniel didn't rush his answer. Instead, he walked with the group back toward the damaged section of the street and examined it once more. He carefully studied the cracks in the pavement, the direction of the water flow, and the soft ground surrounding the road. The same calm concentration that had guided him for years in his construction work returned as he assessed the situation. Then he explained what needed to be done. The leak, as he had suspected, was located several meters away from the visible collapse. Digging directly beneath the cracked pavement would only worsen the problem. Instead, the excavation needed to begin at a precise point where the underground pipe could be safely reached. From there, the damaged section could be replaced and the soil could be reinforced before the pavement was rebuilt. The plan was practical and far less expensive than the proposals offered by the large contractors. But it still required careful coordination. Heavy equipment would be needed. The water line would have to be temporarily shut off. And the excavation had to be done with precision to prevent further collapse. Daniel explained everything step by step. The residents listened carefully. Some of them looked at each other with quiet embarrassment as they realized how much knowledge had been standing quietly at the end of their street all along. For months they had overlooked it. Now they depended on it. Within days, Maplewood Lane began preparing for the repair. Daniel volunteered to lead the project not as a paid contractor but simply as a neighbor willing to help. His only request was that the residents cooperate and follow the plan carefully. For the first time since the Rivera family arrived, the entire neighborhood worked together. Driveways that once displayed expensive cars now held stacks of construction materials. Residents who had rarely spoken to one another before now gathered each morning to assist with preparations. The atmosphere of Maplewood Lane began to change. Where there had once been quiet judgment, there was now shared effort. The excavation began early one cool morning. Daniel directed the work with calm precision. Each step followed the careful plan he had outlined. The damaged section of pipe was eventually uncovered exactly where he predicted it would be. The crack in the pipe was small, but the damage it had caused beneath the street had been enormous. Over several long days, the pipe was replaced and the underground soil was reinforced with stabilizing materials. The ground was slowly rebuilt layer by layer, restoring the strength that had been lost. Finally, the pavement was repaired. When the barriers were removed and cars drove smoothly across the street again, a quiet sense of relief spread across Maplewood Lane. The disaster had been avoided. But the real change in the neighborhood had nothing to do with the road. It had happened in the hearts of the people who lived there. For the first time, many residents truly saw the Rivera family. They saw Daniel's quiet expertise. They saw Maria's patience and kindness. They saw Lucas's determination and quiet intelligence. The small house at the end of the street no longer looked out of place. Instead, it looked like the home of the family that had saved Maplewood Lane. Weeks later, the neighborhood organized a small gathering to celebrate the successful repair. This time, the Rivera family stood at the center of the event. Not as outsiders, but as respected neighbors. Daniel accepted the gratitude with his usual humility. He had never helped the neighborhood to prove a point. He helped because it was the right thing to do. But the lesson Maplewood Lane had learned would not be forgot. For months, the residents had judged the Rivera family based on appearances. They had seen an old truck, a modest home, and simple clothing. What they had failed to see was experience, strength, and integrity. The small house at the end of the street had never represented weakness. It had always represented something far stronger. Resilience. From that day forward, Maplewood Lane changed in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to miss. Neighbors spoke more kindly. Judgments became quieter. And the laughter that once followed the Rivera family was replaced by something else entirely. Respect. Because sometimes the people who appear to have the least are the ones who carry the greatest strength. And sometimes the very people we overlook are the ones we need the most. The road on Maplewood Lane eventually looked perfect again. But the most important repair had taken place somewhere deeper. In the understanding that true value is not measured by appearances. It is revealed through character, patience, and the willingness to help others when they need it most. And the quiet family in the small house at the end of the street had taught the entire neighborhood a lesson that no one there would ever forget.